Good evening, and a Saturday evening to all of us present here today. And we are extremely privileged and honored to have Professor Vandana Singh among us today, who would be talking about time and apocalypse. And we exist in time, and time is a very, very complex concept. And I'm sure she's going to throw enough light for us to have some kind of definition and meaning of time at the end of her session. And without much ado and without wasting any time, which would be very ironical if I did that, I hand over the event to Dr. Soni. And I must thank Soni, for arranging such, amazing talks. And she has been the flag bearer of the department. And so over to you, Soni, to take the event forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Basu, for opening the session, and a very good evening to those joining from the Indian subcontinent, dear colleagues, friends, and the students, of course, which constitute the most important part of the audience today. A very happy morning, as Dr. Basu was saying, to Professor Vandana Singh, who is joining us from the US. And as she mentioned already, that reminds me, good morning and good evening. We are in 2 time zones at the same time, which is a very apt for a talk on time. In other academic events, I don't even notice that. Okay, so here we are. I have been fantasizing about this moment ever since I bumped into Professor Singh's short story called Delhi in a very important anthology of time travel stories. I didn't know her then and didn't realize that such an interaction would be possible. I'm very grateful she's here. Let me introduce her first. Professor Singh is an unusual person to encounter in the way she inhabits interdisciplinary studies by working in physics as well as environmental science. While her background is in theoretical particle physics, her current academic work is on a transdisciplinary conceptualization of the climate crisis. She is a 2021 Climate Imagination Fellow at Arizona State's Center for Science and the Imagination, where along with 3 other international science fiction writers, she has worked on climate fiction in the lead up to the United Nations Conference of the Parties 26th edition, which was a climate conference held in Glasgow in November last year. Her book of short stories, Ambiguity and Other Machines, was a finalist for the 2019 Philip K. Dick Award and the Crossword Book Award. She is a winner of the Carl Brandon Parallax Award for her novella Distances. Her work has been published in numerous magazines and anthologies and has frequently been reprinted in years' best anthologies. She is currently a professor of physics and environment at Framingham State University in the US. Professor Singh, it's a pleasure to have you here. Let me also introduce us to you and also give you some context about what we are doing here. SRM University is situated in Andhra Pradesh in India. We are a very young university established in 2017. I joined the Department of English in 2021. The moment I got some autonomy to design new courses, I began to think about subjects that interest the youth, especially the BTech students. In this semester, I wanted to teach literature and sciences together, but I didn't want to do science fiction in general, in the way it involves textual analysis as an end in itself. Hence, time travel narratives, which is the open elective for which we have gathered here together. The focus of this course is on time travel, which I've been using as a point of discussion from the points of view of philosophy, literature, and cinema. And today with you from the point of view of the end of the world. We are a mix of students from computer science and engineering, mechanical engineering, and electronics and communication engineering. We are 4th-year students, and we opted for this course because it seemed easy and sporting. And some of us opted for this course because it seemed interesting. We thought we would find answers to the paradoxes of time travel in this course. So we have had our crazy different reasons, but hopefully, it's been worth it. We have read a few short stories, watched a few movies, banged our heads while discussing a few philosophers and their views on time and time travel. Overall, let's just say we have survived the paradoxes of time travel and complicated discussions about what time is supposed to mean. Since we have you today here, we are keen to know about apocalypse. We hadn't much thought about the apocalypse from this point of view of physics or time. We have been thinking, well, that it's just the way time travel stories are told these days. The end of the world makes it more thrilling and exciting and adds a lot of drama to a narrative, multiplies the tension in the plot by several times. But today with you, we are curious to know what time has got to do with climate crisis. So with that, over to you, Professor Singh. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Basu. Thank you, Dr. Wadhwa, for that very generous and informative introduction, because I always want to know my audience since I can't be there in person. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I don't think I will be able to give you anything definite about time, because time is such a slippery concept. And from Dr. Wadhwa's description of the course, I think you all have been doing some very sophisticated work and you are better read than I am. So I'm looking forward really to your ideas as well at the end of the talk. All right, so time and the apocalypse. I'm going to give you 5 perspectives on time, but in particular from the perspective of where we stand now globally at the edge of cataclysm. So this painting, this famous painting by Dali, illustrates a number of things that I want to talk about. One is the slipperiness and the fluidity of the idea of time. And the other is, if you look at this bleak landscape with this semi-alive thing in the foreground, that is the catastrophe to which we are walking towards blindly for the most part. So it's from the perspective of this global cataclysm that I'm going to be talking about time, because we are, if you have been paying attention to the world, we are for the first time in human history, confronted with a number of serious problems at the same time, problems that threaten the survival of humankind and the biosphere. And I wish I was exaggerating. I wish that was fiction, but it's not. So from this perspective, what does time look like? I'm going to begin with, in one sense, where the trouble began, and that's the Newtonian linear view of time. We are all familiar with that. So Newton, this is a quote directly from Newton, that time is something that flows essentially in steady steps. Okay, in steady steps and units, in the same way everywhere in the universe, disconnected from everything else. All right. And so that is the absolute notion of time, and time as a linear flow that dominates modern industrial civilization. So, and it's based on a paradigm which is called the Newtonian or the mechanistic paradigm, which thinks of the world as essentially mechanistic. So its ultimate metaphor is the clock, the ticking clock, tick tock, tick tock. And as you can see, the linear aspect of it is in this upper diagram, that the past, you have the past, then you have the present, and then you have the future. And you can relate perhaps to the lower diagram, where we have to divide up our day into sections, and each section we focus on one thing, and so on and so forth. And despite that, however, even though often we ignore the past and we think about the future, we don't inhabit the present very well. Half the time, we are either worrying about something that happened earlier, or we are worrying about the future. So there are all kinds of complications within this view as well. However, this is, I think, not inaccurate to say that this is the dominant view of time that's held in modern industrial civilization all over the world, in part because of colonialism. So here is one view of the apocalypse. It looks fairly harmless for now, at the moment, but this represents the level of carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere over the past million years. So here's our linear time, the time axis, an infinitesimally thin line, in this case, going back nearly 1 million years to a few years ago to 2008, which is when they made this graph. And you can see that carbon dioxide levels go up and down and then shoot up when the Industrial Revolution gets going, with the first time that fossil fuels were burned, coal, oil, and gas. So carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere shoot up. And because carbon dioxide is a heat trapper, it heats the planet, even though it's a very, very small percentage of the atmosphere. So that's one way of looking at apocalypse and time. And you can see linear time here in that line, that horizontal line. But perhaps the best way to express linear time, and we'll come back to that graph a little later, but perhaps the best way to express it is through poetry, through literature. And no one has done it to my knowledge better than Shakespeare in Macbeth, where the famous speech, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day till the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. So we can see how linear time is expressed here, and we can also see how terrifying it is, going steadily towards the end, and especially if you know that the end is catastrophic. So, but what about other views of time? Well, in physics, we know that time is not, despite Newton, Einstein discovered that time is not so straightforward, that time actually depends on a number of other factors, like it depends on speed, for example. So this is the famous twin paradox. It's not actually a paradox, but nevertheless, it appears to us to be one. So here's a pair of sisters, twins, who one of them leaves on this spaceship, and you can see that they've aligned their clocks. But when the traveling sister comes back, then time has passed for her more slowly in relative terms than it has back on Earth. So her twin sister is now an old woman while she's still young. So we know that this is true. It's been shown through experiment, not as dramatic as this example, but through clocks and airplanes and things like that. And yet, we still are dominated by the notion of linear absolute time. There's another way that time is relative, and that's because it also depends on gravity. So we know, for instance, that time slows down close to large mass objects like the Earth or like a star, and then it runs faster when you're further away from it. And so, those old Rip Van Winkle type stories really have some foundation if you put them in space in the proper context. So time depends on gravity. And in fact, anyone who drives and uses GPS, the satellites that track your position actually have to correct for this factor, because they're far away from the Earth, and so time runs faster for them than it does for us on the surface of the Earth. So these are very real things, the relativity of time. So that's my second point here, the second way of looking at time as this thing that does not flow the same way for everyone. Time is relative. What about other possibilities? So let's look at science fictional inspirations, by the way. So I'm trying to weave in some science fiction, some fiction in general. I am not a literary expert, and I defer to the people in this room for that. But nevertheless, I'm just pointing out 2 out of the uncountable number of science fiction novels that have taken inspiration from the notion of relative time. One classic one, of course, Time Machine, and the other one equally classic but more recent, The Dispossessed, where the structure of the novel is actually going forward in time, braided with going backward in time, which I thought was very interesting. So other conceptions of time, we know that the linear conception of time is not the only one, that cultures often, or while they have a grasp of linear time, they often mess with it in creative ways. So this, while I don't necessarily take, Richard Lewis's models too seriously, because, they seem to be broad brush generalizations and somewhat stereotypical. Nevertheless, this does illustrate some difference in cultural conceptions of time. So for example, if you have this is your plan for the day, in America, many people will have the time divided up, the day divided up into these little compartments, and you focus on one thing at a time and you get it done. But what this illustration is showing is that there are cultures that have a more elastic view of time. And ours is among them because Indian stretchable time, yeah. So the Spanish conception of time, and among other Southern European cultures also, you mess with that rigid structure a little bit. But then also among other cultural conceptions are cyclic conceptions, of course. So you have the Hindu and Buddhist Kal Chakra concept. So this picture on the left-hand side shows the Bhava Chakra, the cyclic existence in Buddhism. And then on the right-hand side is a Mayan solar calendar. The Mayans also famously came up with cycles in large sweeps of time. And so we can think of time instead of a straight line as something that's a circle or a spiral, where things that happened before come back, perhaps in a changed form, but nevertheless return. And typically indigenous peoples who lived and still live, some of them, close to the cycles of nature, are also susceptible to this conception of cyclic time. So these have also, of course, fiction has played, with this concept, with alternate conceptions of time quite a bit, and not just science fiction, not just speculative fiction. So we have Proust's novel, we have Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude. We also have this remarkable speculative fiction novel by Yoko Ogawa, most recently, The Memory Police, which entangles notions of time and memory. And these are just 3 examples, of which I've only read 2, of many, many, many ways of playing with time. And the novel by Ursula Le Guin, The Dispossessed, is also an example of playing with time in a structural way through fiction. So, but what else? Now, there's another way that physics thinks about time. And that has to do with the second law of thermodynamics. So I know that many people in the room would be very familiar with this as well. And the one statement of it is that in any closed system, entropy, which measures microscopic disorder, cannot decrease. It can never decrease, it can only increase. So in other words, if you look at this illustration, it shows it beautifully that when an egg falls off the table, it smashes, but you never have the egg reconstituting itself and jumping back on the table, even though that is allowed by conservation of energy. Like the egg could take energy from air molecules and reconstitute itself and, jump back up. But that never happens. And in fact, this is still a great mystery in one sense, even though people have come up with very creative ideas to solve it. That if you look at the laws of physics at the fundamental scale, at the microscopic scale, most of them are invariant or insensitive to the direction of time. So if you replace t with minus t, in other words, if you go backwards in time instead of forward, then the equation remains the same. The results remain the same. And yet we know that in the real physical world, at our scale and beyond, that doesn't happen. We have a direction, an arrow of time. And that is ultimately related to the notion that statistically, there are many more ways to have disorder than to have order. Order is, in a sense, an exception. So for life to create order, it has to increase net entropy because it's lowering entropy within the physical system of the living thing. So the direction of increased entropy is a kind of direction of time, and that's the thermodynamic arrow of time. And this is another fascinating concept, and I'm going to work this in to lead us to the 5th concept of time. But before that, I want to point out that entropy, the idea of entropy, has also been played with in science fiction. And so we have the classic Philip K. Dick Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. We have Gravity's Rainbow. We have The Heat Death of the Universe, which is actually a physics concept that at the highest level of entropy, everything will cease to be. There will be no more things happening in the universe. So So these ideas are often treated metaphorically in fiction. So you can think of entropy as chaos, the agent of chaos that's always, the eternal dance of chaos and order in the universe, and chaos is the manifestation of entropy. So this has certainly been there in science fiction. But I want to point out something that I think this fourth concept is hinting towards, which is that it's trying to say, in opposition to Einsteinian relativity, where time is a very fundamental concept, I think what this is trying to say is that time is an emergent phenomenon. In other words, rather than being a fundamental property of the universe, it arises due to interactions with different things. So I'm not going to explain this diagram too much, except that this is a simulation of a bunch of small masses interacting gravitationally, and just Newton's laws of gravity. So it's ironical that we bring in Newton here for the interactions, and yet when you run this simulation, it ends up in one of two possible futures where there is much more disorder. So it starts off as small, cold, and relatively ordered, and then it ends up with greater disorder. And so this really evokes this notion that perhaps time emerges from interactions. And that would be really, really interesting to pursue. And there's some really interesting work that it points to. Now, here's the fictional element. I don't know if you've come across this short story, A Sound of Thunder by Ray Bradbury. It's a classic. And in this story, basically, I'm not going to tell the whole story, but the whole idea is that, people go back in time as tourists to the age of the dinosaurs. And it's very, very important that you don't mess with anything there. You don't leave anything behind. You don't destroy anything, because that could change history. And a man steps on a butterfly and the future has changed. So interestingly, Edward Lorenz, the meteorologist who discovered chaos and discovered that weather was a chaotic system, this is a graph from actually his work. He did something very interesting. He was running a program to predict weather. This was in the 1970s. So you can see ups and downs of temperature, right, over the days like this. And then he decided that he wanted to restart the program, and he started it in the middle, and he fed the same values that he had before, except he rounded them off. Okay. And then he went to have a cup of coffee, and he came back, and he found that the second iteration of the program followed the first one, as you can see very closely, for about 5 or 6 days, and then started to diverge dramatically. So this tiny effect actually made a huge difference within about 10 days or so, which is one reason why weather prediction is actually not possible accurately beyond about 5 days or so. So he discovered what he called the butterfly effect. I believe he did not know about the story of Ray Bradbury, but he was looking for a metaphor to describe this chaotic effect. And he came up with eventually that a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon can cause a tornado in Texas. So it's a remarkable coincidence that the same butterfly shows up in both these very different scenarios. So, does time emerge from complexity, and therefore does it imply irreversibility? So, and I just want to point to this, which I discovered recently, some work that's ongoing at the Santa Fe Institute for Complex Systems, where they're looking at time and age together. And what they're saying is that living systems actually have multiple arrows of time, because we have different structures. We have cellular structures, we have structures at the organ level, and so on and so forth. And each has its own kind of arrow of time. And so what they're trying to come up with is a theory of complex time applied to living systems. And they make this remarkable statement that age is not only biological, it's environmental, technological, and cultural. So I'm going to leave that as a kind of interesting provocation. But again, within my theme here, that perhaps time is an emergent phenomenon that emerges from interactions. So again, let's go back to this graph that I showed you, which is one way of looking at our unfolding horror of the apocalypse, where we have linear time here. And this is actually frightening because there's a ticking clock, and anyone who's keeping in touch with climate science or with the loss of biodiversity or any of the other disasters ought to be frightened out of their minds, because it is very, very serious. So we are seeing, just with 1.1 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, compared to pre-industrial times, we are seeing more extreme weather. We are seeing sea level rise accelerating. We are seeing the systems on the planet, the biophysical systems that keep us alive, spiraling out of control. And that's happening because of this. So when you look at it from a linear perspective, that this is what happened in the past, this graph gives us context to know that what's happening now is not natural, that this breaks the cycle of the last million years or so. So, we should be concerned. We should want to do something urgently. However, if you look at the details of this graph, and if you set it in context, then you actually see that it is composed of multiple kinds of interactions. So these cycles, for instance, are represent what are called the Milankovitch cycles, which have to do with interactions between the other planets and the Earth, making its orbit a little bit shaky. And that itself has an interaction with the Arctic sea ice extent, which changes ocean currents, which changes, and the biosphere, which changes things. So all of these spikes and dips are a result of complex interactions in space and on the planet. And then here we have interactions changing again between humans and nature. So humans appear in this graph between 300,000 to 200,000 years ago. And here, this right here where the scale is not very helpful, but somewhere here, we emerge into what is called the Holocene, the last 12,000 years of relatively steady temperatures and relatively warm temperatures with the retreat of the glaciers, okay? And we've blown that. We have messed with that. Everything that we take for granted in our civilization, we do not recognize that we owe it to larger cycles and interactions that are taking place around us and beyond us. So what I'm trying to say here is that hidden in this linear timeline is a history of interactions. And so similarly with the sixth mass extinction, so the Earth has had 5 mass extinctions before. The 6th mass extinction is due to the activities of modern industrial civilization. And so there's a number of more than about 1 million species are under threat of extinction, which is why the UN is currently, as we speak, holding a conference in Montreal to try to see if we can legislate our way out of this mess. And yet the ticking clock is not the whole story, as I'm trying to make the point of. So this is a picture, literally, of a ticking clock in Times Square in New York, where they have a climate clock. And that's pointing to how many years are left before we blow the carbon budget. That is the limit of carbon that we can let into the atmosphere before the biophysical systems of the Earth get beyond any kind of reparation or repair. So, but it's not the whole story, because when we think of the ticking clock, what happens? Our minds freeze, right? We find ourselves fearing for the future. And that's important because we must acknowledge what we feel, but we mustn't get stuck in fear. We have to work our way through it. And there's only one way to do that. And that's where I'm going with the 5th notion of time as kinship. And this is based partly on, the term time as kinship comes from this beautiful essay, which is freely available on the internet by Dr. Kyle White, who's a professor and a scholar of Indigenous studies and an Indigenous person himself at the University of Michigan. And what he's saying is that linear time, that ticking clock, evokes the fear response, but it also has been used for generations as an excuse for the powerful to have their way, to say, oh, we need power, we need energy, we need to do this, we need to do that, so get out of our way. And indigenous people in North America and everywhere in the world have suffered from other people coming in and saying, oh, there's something very important we have to do. This dam is very important, so get out of the way. Or this coal mine, as what's happening in India right now in the Hasdeo forest, this coal mine is too important to meet India's energy needs. So the hell with this oldest contiguous forest in the country, knock it down and let the Adivasis be kicked off the land. It's also happening in the Nicobar Islands with the Great Nicobar Project. So the idea of linear time has been used by power, by colonialists, by the powerful within nations to basically subdue and push aside and oppress people who are not as powerful. And so what he's saying is that while we need to obviously acknowledge that something very important is happening, and the linear time way of looking at things helps us see the urgency of the problem, it's also something that can be appropriated. And therefore, is there some alternative? And is there some way of getting through, not avoiding the fear and the despair and the grief, but working through the fear and the despair and the grief in a way that we can have a just future, not just an ecologically harmonious future, but a just one and an equitable one? And so he proposes this notion of kinship time. And in his paper, he contrasts the two ways of telling the story of the climate. So first, he talks about how climate scientists present climate change as a linear unfolding of climatic events, pointing towards a pretty grim future, which we have to admit can happen unless we take the right action. And then he talks about how Native Americans in various places in North America are telling the story of climate through adapting their own old cultural stories, through talking about, how the relationship between the thunder beings and the great panther are changing and things like that. So he gives examples of different stories being told to explain the climate phenomenon in a way that is not linear time so much as a story or a history of changing and broken relationships. So it begins with relationships, okay, among and between humans and non-humans. And he points out that kinship does not mean, in his way, kinship is not family relationships. Kinship is broader than that. Kinship is our relationships with everyone and not just human, also going beyond the human, with plants, with animals and everything. So, and specifically, these relationships are not relationships of power over, but relationships of responsibility, mutual caretaking, and mutual guardianship. So these are mutualities. These are responsibilities that come from mutual care. And what he says is that if you take this view of time, as if you look at, for instance, modernity as an era in which deep relationships have changed and broken, then you say, well, what do we do about climate change? Or what do we do about species extinction? They're all related at the root, because modern industrial civilization, our current socioeconomic system, is trashing the living systems of the planet. And ultimately, it's going to hit us, and already is hitting a number of people. So what are we going to do? Well, what he's saying is that this is not any less urgent. So kinship time allows us to be to respond as urgently, but our orientation is completely different than the ticking clock. Our orientation is we look at each other, we connect with each other, we connect with the non-humans, whether it's in the immediate surround or across the world, and we figure out what is it that we need to do to rebuild those relationships. So he's asking us to take that starting point. And so shifts in kinship relationships, how can we repair relationships? That's what it's ultimately about. And so we see this in in various indigenous traditions, some closer to home. And here are a couple more quotes from Dr. White's paper that, and you can see, I hope, how this sort of works with and is consistent with the research on complex time as a emergent phenomenon due to interactions, due to relationships, because after all, interactions are relationships. But here, Dr. White is bringing in an ethical perspective as well, that those relationships must be based on interdependence, on trust, consent, and reciprocity. So perhaps the metaphor of time that we need, and I tried to put this forth in a TED talk, actually a TED performance piece that I did last year, where I contrast the metaphor of the ticking clock with the metaphor of a living tapestry. And if we worked with that, would we be somewhere else than we are today? So, and here's an example of what we are doing instead of what we should be doing. So I don't know if many people know that there's an approved plan which has got environmental clearance of essentially destroying the Great Nicobar Island, displacing the tribals, and destroying the biodiversity. This is one of the UNESCO's World Heritage Biodiverse Sites. So how do we mend all these relationships that we are breaking? Well, I wish I had the full answer to that question. I only have hints and intimations, but I'm going to end with this, that speculative fiction in potential has the power to help us shift our perspectives. And I'm not as well read in my own genre as I'd like to be, but I haven't come across many examples of kinship time in speculative fiction. So we have certainly absolute time, cyclic time, relative time, time's arrow, and the second law. But what about looking at time as this complex phenomenon from which emerges from relationships and mutuality? And what about kinship time in relationship to the apocalypse, in a way of walking through the valley of dread, despair, and fear to whatever awaits us on the other side? And there's one book on my reading list. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to. It just won an award this year and came out this year. And it's written by a Native American Lipan Apache writer, Darcy Little Badger, whose short stories are very good. I have not read this yet. But this book is apparently something that, while I don't know if she uses the term kinship time, from its description, it certainly seems to be about relationships and complexity and the apocalypse. So I recommend it. And thank you all for your attention. I look forward to discussing all this with you.
That's the ironic part. I mean, I say thank you, that was beautiful, or I say thank you, that was horrible. That's the thing with time. I mean, especially the thing that you pointed out about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and the Times Square, the ticking image that you showed us. Mm-hmm. This is the funny thing. At one level, you try to make the subject interesting, very engaging. At the same point of time, how do you make something like? How do you sell something so urgent, something so morbid? So, but thank you. I request, if there are any questions, please post them in the chat box and we will take them one by one. In the meantime, let us continue the conversation as the students are thinking about, what is it that we have covered and what is it that we have not covered so far in the class as well.
Sonia, I think there are 2 questions in the chat box.
But they are sort of self-explanatory and they need far wider discussion than, what they look like very little simple questions, but they are difficult.
Well, do you want me to start with those or?
Sure. Do you want to? Yeah, let me read out the first one for you, which is, what is meant by apocalypse?
Well, apocalypse is basically a disaster at a very large scale, usually involving natural elements. Okay, so we use the term in both local ways and global ways. So locally, you could say, if there's a big extreme weather event, like a huge flood or a huge storm, and it results in a lot of devastation, or an earthquake, something like that. That would be an apocalypse at a local scale. But then the way I mean it is a global apocalypse, because after all, we are faced with major crises that are manifesting in pretty severe ways around the world. So that's what I mean. I mean it in the global sense of massive disasters. Yeah, how can we turn back time? Well, that's, here's the thing. Despite all the science fiction novels that talk about time travel, going back into the past or the future, at least going back to the past is not possible under physical law as we know it. So, that's why we speculative fiction writers have to come up with all kinds of, imaginative ways to go beyond that barrier. But you can't really go back in time, partly because there would be paradoxes, and partly because of the famous critique that, if you go back and kill your grandparent or some ancestor, then you'd cease to exist, right? And people have different ways of thinking about that. But after all, if you think about memory, it's an imperfect time machine, but it is a time machine. We don't always remember things accurately. Nevertheless, it's a way of kind of, making sense. Without memory, our lives don't make sense. Even music doesn't make sense, right? So memory is an imperfect time machine. But in a wider sense, if you talk about how can we turn back time, sometimes people use that politically, like, they talk about a golden age, bringing back a golden age and all of that. You can't do that either, because we are different people than the people who lived long ago. What we hope we can do, is like, let's say if we want to restore our ecosystems, and people are actually thinking about how to do that. And in fact, working with indigenous people, with Adivasis around the world, to see how you can actually restore ecosystems. Scientists are actually collaborating with native peoples. Well, again, the ecosystems you're going to get are not going to be the same as they were before. We are going to end up with something different. So, alas, we cannot turn back time in many senses of the word. So shall I just go through the questions on the chat?
Yeah,
do you want me to
I'll read them.
Okay, please do. Yeah.
Shreya is asking, ma'am, do you think time travel would become a reality with advancements in modern quantum physics and technology? Partly you answered that, but.
Yeah, well, I should say that there's a lot we don't understand about the quantum aspect. There's some very interesting recent experiments and we know actually that there are, particle physics used to be my area. There are actually elementary particle reactions that would just as well go backwards in time. And there are some that don't. So at the very fundamental grainy level of the universe, time actually becomes very slippery, even more slippery than before. So people have said that you can actually, for a fraction of a second, make time go backwards at the quantum level. But is that going to manifest at our level? Probably not. It may just point to the fact that, or to the possibility rather, that time is an emergent phenomenon that only makes sense when you have a lot of interactions. Temperature is the same way. You don't talk about temperature of one molecule. Temperature is a property of an aggregate. So it could be that time is a property of an aggregate too. So yeah. Good. I like the question.
Which reminds me, just last week, there was this very big news about some scientists having found a way to create a wormhole and pass information through it. That was just one piece of news, and it made it created caused quite a stir. Okay.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Bharat is asking, do you ever know the ending of a tale before you begin writing it?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, completely in keeping with, I like all the questions, but this one particularly keeps with the, please, you want to comment on it before I continue?
It's a question addressed to a writer.
Okay. Well, okay. I sometimes do know the ending of a story before I write it. So sometimes I just, and again, that's the slippery nature of time in the brain, right? How we conceive time. And sometimes that's true. Other times, I don't know how it's going to end. I have to write it to find out, which is why writing can be such an adventure, because I really don't know what's going to happen. There are other times also where I think I know the end, but but as I write the story, the characters start to tell me what to do, and then the ending turns out to be different than what I initially thought. So time plays tricks on writers all the time. Yeah.
Okay. I'll come back to Akash's question a little later because he asked the very first question. Akhil is asking, this question is about your short story, Delhi. How did you come across the idea of having a science fiction time travel story with a lot of physics concepts like causality and concepts of free will to convey a message extrapolating social issues of our society?
Thank you for that question, Akhil. I, did not have any idea of where this story was going. This was one of the stories that I wrote the first sentence, and then I wrote the second sentence and the third sentence. And each time I wrote a sentence, it suggested a particular direction. And so I let the words kind of lead me to the story. However, it's whatever the things that are important to you are going to come through in your piece of writing. So for me, I'm fascinated by ideas of causality and so on and so forth, and including the idea of free will, which in the Newtonian mechanistic paradigm actually doesn't even exist, right? So, and as far as social issues, I was raised to be, well, firstly, I was brought up in a family that really, really recognized the importance of all forms of knowledge. So not just science, but also literature, poetry, all of that. And, our education system in India has become too compartmentalized in many ways. So, if most of you are students of engineering and so on, it's wonderful that you're taking a class like this, because this is going to help you be better human beings as well, And so I grew up with science, economics, poetry, literature, history, all of that being discussed at the table. And I also grew up in a very much anti-caste family, and basically with the idea, my paternal grandmother was part of the salt satyagraha, so she was an independence fighter, and so I was always brought up with this concept that don't take for granted what you have. There are people who have been unfairly shut out of sharing power in society, and that we must always put them front and center. Like if anything is proposed, always ask, how will the most marginalized person in the country benefit from or suffer from this proposal? Always keep them front and center. And I have taken that to heart. So for me, although I didn't know what I was doing when I first started writing this story, I was led sentence by sentence to the conclusions and to the ideas. And so, however, the things that fascinate me, they tend to kind of ferment in the mind, and then they come up in unexpected ways. So this story was a surprise to me when I finished writing it. So I hope that answers your question to some extent.
To a great extent, yes. And what the students are really not asking is, reading Delhi a little after H.G. Wells was like, spooky in the sense there is this idea of the lower Delhi, the Eloi and the Molochs, right? So we were wondering the subtle influences that have sort of, crept in, or maybe they are not influences at all. This is something that we are reading as readers.
Well, it could, I actually hadn't read H.G. Wells' Time Machine, except in extracts, when I was a kid, perhaps maybe a chapter or something from it. So it wasn't a direct influence. I read it later after I wrote Delhi. So yeah, but I can see that there's, there's some kind of obviously relationship between the two.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. There is one, Uday Kiran is asking, how does time vary in different gravitational fields? So it's a physics question.
Yeah, well, essentially what we found is that if you look at Einstein's conception of gravity, gravity is not a force in the way it is in Newton's conception. Gravity is instead a kind of side effect of the curvature of space and time. So firstly, you don't have space and time being separate anymore. You have something called space-time. And the classic model of that, the two-dimensional version, is that if you have a rubber sheet and you hold it horizontally, and then you put a very heavy ball in the middle, that ball is going to distort that rubber sheet. So the rubber sheet is basically space-time, or the fabric of space-time. And so what Einstein's trying to say is that matter distorts space-time. And so, when you shoot a marble across the rubber sheet, it's going to maybe take a few circles around that ball, the heavy ball in the center, and may even fall onto it, right? So what we would think of as gravitational force, what Einstein is saying is basically due to the bending of space-time by matter. And one consequence of that is that time actually goes more slowly. And there's a beautiful explanation of that has to do with, look up gravitational time dilation. So, there's a thought experiment in which, you have a person on Earth and you have a person that's accelerating down in an elevator, okay? And it's something called the principle of equivalence. So in other words, what happens is that wherever you have more gravity, time flows more slowly. And where you have less gravity, time flows faster. So if you go to near a black hole, for example, where a black hole is an extreme gravitational object having enormous mass concentrated in essentially a point. And if you go too close to it, you'll find that for you, time will not pass any differently. But for someone who's waiting for you further away, it may be hundreds of years before you return, whereas for you, maybe half an hour would have passed. And of course, if you go past a certain point near the black hole called the event horizon, then there's no coming back either. So, and in fact, when you approach it, time will stretch out in a way that it's almost like someone watching from the further away will see you just stop there. Okay, so it'll seem like time has stopped. So time and gravity is absolutely fascinating. Look up gravitational time dilation.
We will do that. I need to pick. I can't, do all the questions. But there was something interesting that I found here. Raj Kalyan, he's asking, what do you think? Apocalypse will be the beginning or ending of our relationship with time?
That is partly up to us, because if we let it go on, then, and we are not here to see what happens, then as far as we're concerned, time has ended with the apocalypse. But I'm a kind of defiant optimist, an optimism of the will, perhaps, where I am not, I look at reality in the eye, but I also say, well, let's do something about it. So I think through really trying to understand what kinship time means, I think that we can get through the apocalypse. And sometimes the destruction of one world, going back to the notion of cyclic time, can be the birth of another world. And so this era in human history, in the Earth's history, has been referred to by philosophers like Joanna Macy, for instance, as simultaneously the great destruction and the great turning. Is it going to be the great turning towards the birth of a new way of living on the planet? Or are we going to self-destruct? And that is really up to us collectively.
That's where it gets tricky. My students keep asking, okay, we know all these possibilities exist, but what is the solution? Or, time travel exists or does not exist, or what is the solution to the paradox? Or tell us ultimately what is the answer. But they don't get comfortable when all of these possibilities exist.
Yeah, you have to be comfortable with uncertainty first, and to remember that sometimes the solutions can only come up when you have the right kinds of interactions. So when we sit together and build relationships over a cup of chai and samosas or whatever, and really think about, and then see, okay, how are we living? And it's not just about individual solutions, it's about the collective. So what is happening? Like, for instance, how can we, because all hope is not lost just because the Great Nicobar project has been approved, how can we make sure that this doesn't happen? What does it take? If we look at the history of social movements, if we look at the fact that indigenous resistance movements have actually stopped or stalled 25% of large projects like this, at great cost often. But how does this happen? So it's you have to. So here's the thing: in the Newtonian way of thinking about the world like a machine has parts that have straightforward interactions, like a clock, right? You understand the springs, the gears, you've understood the clock. Often in engineering, that is the invisible motif of how we think, okay? And however, the world is not a clock. The universe is not a clock. We know that from what physics has discovered, from what the new science of complex systems is telling us. We know that the universe or the world is more akin to an organism than a clock, more like a living tapestry in which we are woven. We are not separate from it, okay? And so we cannot, so engineering is excellent at, and we need it for problems that are clearly defined, okay? So, but when it comes to what are called wicked problems, which have, not just engineering, but there's like issues of economics, of justice, of ethics, of philosophy, of social sciences, and all of that, then actually, without that complex holistic knowledge, engineers can end up doing harm. Like, I'll give you one example. The Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans several years ago and absolutely devastated the city. So many deaths and so many disproportionate among the African American population. So again, injustice rearing its ugly head. In the 1960s and 70s, the US Army Corps of Engineers decided that the New Orleans marshlands, the coastal wetlands, were a waste of space. So what did they do? They drained them and they built levees. What they did not know is that nature, one of the things nature does is that coastal marshlands, mangroves, ecosystems, seagrasses, all of those coastal wetlands actually are a huge buffer for storms. They actually protect the storms so that the floodwaters, for instance, have a place to go, a place to sink into, and so on and so forth. And you may have heard, perhaps, that in the US, interestingly, a number of dams are being deconstructed. Okay, dams are being actually taken down. The Colorado River was so dammed up that it could not flow into the ocean anymore. And people have realized that these, what they thought of as straightforward engineering solutions to, bringing water to the desert, it's got many, many, many more ramifications. And it's only when you think in terms of relationships and complexity that you realize that, okay? Now, that doesn't mean we don't need engineering, but engineering needs to change to have this broader holistic perspective and to learn from nature. If you look up the biomimicry movement in engineering and design, where people are learning from nature, like, how does nature do this? Do we need giant windmills? Well, look at how fish and birds flock and swarm. They're using that for new windmill design, okay, which is not so materials intensive. So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, but I think one of the things to recognize is to have faith in the process of thinking complexly. And that can never be done alone. That can never be done in a small group. That can never be done, in a company, so much as you have to know where all the wider connections are, including to the non-human. very importantly, to the non-human. We are their kin, they are our relatives, right? And we have shut them out of our institutions, of our education, out of our lives. And but the thing is, they are suffering. All the living beings on the earth are suffering, but we are part of them. So we are going to suffer too. What happens to them is going to happen to us. So unless we recognize that kinship, we are not going to be able to solve those problems. So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that, oh, we should first sit and think and fix ourselves and then do something. That's not what I'm saying, because the problems are upon us. We have to act. But what I'm saying is, let's reorient our perspective, okay, and then act. And if we reorient that perspective, if our orienting metaphor is not the ticking clock so much as the living tapestry of which we are part, or whatever other metaphor that embodies complexity and relationship and mutuality, then our solutions and so on will be different. We'll be thinking of repairing and restoring and not destroying. So, and that's great. That's actually a source of great joy, because, we'll feel connected to each other. The modern industrial civilization's major problem of social isolation and loneliness in the Western countries, that's huge. The UK has a ministry for loneliness, okay? Isolation, loneliness, anxiety, depression, all of those, like working together for something, for restoration of ourselves and the planet. I mean, what can be a more joyful task than that? So, sorry, long answer, but important question. So,
and it's very important that someone else other than me, says such things and connects these things with in the wider context. And I'm very, very grateful that you pointed this out. Now, there are many, many questions, and I've already exceeded your time. I had promised you I'll take only 1 hour, but could we have just one last question?
Sure.
You spoke about the West. This question by Aditya is about, Hinduism, and referring to the slide that you showed us about the cyclical notion of time. Mm-hmm. Aditya is asking, thank you for such an in-depth presentation, but what if the apocalypse is a part of time? No matter what we do in a grand scale, time might be nothing but ending and then resetting again from the start, like mentioned in the Hindu Puranas, like the 4 yugas. This brings us to a new question of where is time already, whether time is already predetermined. So, is the Eastern philosophy or these kinds of things answer to it, or is it just complicating the questions even more, or is the Eastern philosophy also a way of furthering the Western notions of development?
Well, I mean, that's a yes and no. There are a couple of ways to think about it. So, one of the things that, so we can look at it as, yes, we are in Kali Yuga, and Kali Yuga is going to take a long time to get over, right? I think it's almost 500,000 years or something, according to the old texts. But the thing is that, we don't have to be fatalistic about it either. Because even if, let's suppose for the sake of argument that, Kali Yuga is unfolding as we speak, right? Mm-hmm. And in a sense, you can say, oh, there's nothing I can do about it, so might as well just do what we're doing, okay? That is irresponsible. And that is also ignoring the fact that, if this is Kali Yuga, that is happening because of people taking certain actions. And people always have choices. So if certain people are not making the right choices, doesn't that give us more responsibility that we at least should make the right choices, right? And for the possibility of another world to come up from Kali Yuga, there always have to be people working for that. Without that, maybe Kali Yuga will be the end, right? So I think that the way to look at it really is that not to look at it as something that's simply unfolding, which is an excuse for business as usual. Okay, oh, this is going to happen. This was written, it's going to happen. Well, it's happening because people are doing certain things, okay, people who should not be doing those things. And if we want to emerge from Kali Yuga, then, we are the actors in this drama, we are the actors, along with the wind and the weather and other species. We are the actors in this drama. We can't say, oh, the play has already been written, I'm going to walk off the stage. That's not behaving like a responsible person. So we have to be part of it, and we have to choose that am I going to be part of the destruction of the world, or am I going to be part of its regeneration? The other thing is that many of these ideas are often meant in a metaphorical sense. So, we can also think of destruction of illusions, right? Well, let us destroy our illusions here, our illusions about being separate from the rest of nature, our illusions of absolute control over everything, things like that. So we need to destroy some things. We need to destroy those rotten power structures that make a powerful few dominate over marginalized human groups and as well as marginalized nature. So there are some things we need to destroy, all right. And it all goes to changing relationships. So if we all give up and throw up our hands, we are guaranteeing that those in power are going to run roughshod over us. So, and we cannot let that happen, even if it means that for our generation, we will not see change. Think about the person who plants an olive tree, which takes a very, very long time to grow, an old man who plants an olive tree, knowing that he'll never see it beyond a sapling. Okay, we have to be good ancestors.
That's a very beautiful note to wind up together, to tie everything together. But I think this also means that you should come again.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you to the students for such wonderful questions and for being so engaged. And I think you're very lucky to be in this class with Dr. Wadhwa. So enjoy it to the full. I don't know if you're just ending your term. Is that right?
22nd is our last date.
I see. Yeah.
So, so my point was, please come back again. But at this point of time, let me call upon Dr. Shravani Basu to deliver the vote of thanks. And let's also have a Zoom selfie or a group photograph in the meantime. Ma'am, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Soni. Mere words are not enough to thank Professor Singh for being here with us today, for your amazingly insightful inputs. And I'm sure all of us here, we have been enlightened and enriched by all that you've shared with us today. And also on behalf of the university, on behalf of the department, on behalf of our students, we thank you profusely. And since this was all about, time, and I'm not going into the apocalypse part, I'll prefer to stick to time travel. So we expect you to see very soon. We expect to have you, in an interactive session with all of us very soon. So we'll travel along with time. And thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Soni.
Thanks to you, ma'am, for the support and the vote of thanks. A big shout out to the ITKM team and the communications team too. Finally, Professor Singh, please come again, online or offline, to extend this conversation. Good day to you and good night to one another.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It was an honor and a pleasure. All my best to you and good night. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. We could end the meeting here.
Yeah, Soni. I think we could end.